I remember the first time I saw her. It was our last year of high school, and we were both young, carefree, filled with dreams and the naive belief that we had all the time in the world. Her name was Amelia, and she was everything I could have ever wanted. She laughed like the world belonged to her, and her smile could light up even the darkest day. I was the quiet guy, always staying in the shadows, but she was a brilliant star that suddenly burst into my life, completely changing it. We were inseparable after school. We would walk in the park, watch movies, and talk for hours about our dreams and plans for the future. I was convinced that our love was something that would last forever. She believed it too. I remember how we'd dream of moving to the big city, building our careers, yet always staying together. Back then, the world seemed so simple and clear. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After graduation, fate pulled us apart. She received a scholarship to a prestigious business school abroad, and I decided to stay behind to pursue a law degree. We promised each other that we'd keep in touch, that our love would survive the distance. But with each passing day, week, and month, it became harder. Our conversations grew shorter, our letters more infrequent. And one day, her responses simply stopped coming. It was as if the wind had blown away everything we had, and just like that, we vanished from each other's lives. More than 10 years passed. I became a lawyer, throwing myself completely into my work. I worked long hours, building a career that consumed every part of me. I told myself I had forgotten that young love that once meant everything to me. But as I would soon find out, the past doesn't disappear so easily. It was just another ordinary day at the office when my assistant knocked on my door. She brought in a new case. A client needed consultation on a complex corporate matter. I took the documents without even glancing at the name and dove into my work. But when the time came to meet the client, I looked up and nearly dropped my pen. Standing before me was Amelia. She looked even more confident than she had back in school. Her brown eyes still sparkled, and her smile was exactly as I remembered it, the same one that used to make my heart race. For a moment, I was frozen, overwhelmed by the flood of memories. But I quickly composed myself, trying to stay professional. "Max?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of disbelief. "Is it really you?" "Yes, it's me," I replied, struggling to hide the tremor in my voice. "It's been a long time, Amelia." She seemed taken aback for a second, but quickly regained her composure and switched to business mode. We sat down at my desk to discuss her legal needs, but I could barely concentrate. My mind was spinning with questions. What had happened to her over the years? Why did she stop writing? And why did my heart still react to her smile as if no time had passed at all? As our meeting came to an end, she dropped a bombshell that felt like a punch to the gut. She was engaged. Her wedding was just a few months away. I forced a smile, pretending to be happy for her. But inside, everything crumbled. She was already someone else's. We started working together on her case, and she often came to my office. Each meeting was torture. I tried to keep things strictly professional, but it grew harder with each passing day. I noticed how her eyes would light up when she laughed at my jokes, how her gaze would linger on me a moment too long. And I knew she felt it too, even if she was trying to deny it to herself. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, she asked me to stay a little longer. "Max, I don't understand what's happening," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. Her voice was the same as it used to be, soft and full of unspoken emotions, and I realized that my heart still belonged to her. "Amelia, we can't keep doing this," I replied, though every word felt like it was being torn from my soul. "You're getting married. I don't want to be the one to ruin your life." She turned away, as if trying to hide the tears welling up in her eyes. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Max," she whispered, and at that moment, it felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. Our eyes met, and in that instant, everything we felt for each other was written clearly on our faces. We both knew that continuing down this path would only lead to heartbreak, yet neither of us could pull away. That conversation changed everything. We could no longer pretend that nothing was happening between us. But every conversation, every touch reminded me that she was engaged to another man. As much as I tried to convince myself to let her go, my heart refused to listen. And so, we found ourselves falling deeper into the impossible. It was like two people standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would send them over but unable to turn back. Every night, I lay awake, torn between the urge to let her go and the desperate need to hold onto the last bit of happiness I had found in her eyes. But I knew this was just the beginning. I could feel the weight of what was to come. Our story was far from over, and the road ahead was going to be filled with choices that would test both of us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. The days after our first meeting felt like I was living in a dream, one that was as exhilarating as it was painful. Every time I walked into my office, I wondered if she would be there, waiting for me with that familiar smile that had once made me believe in forever. And yet, every time I saw her, I was reminded of the ring on her finger and the future she had already chosen. But we couldn't stop. Our paths kept crossing, first for business reasons, then for reasons neither of us could name. She would come to discuss her case, but our conversations would inevitably drift to old memories, shared laughter, and moments that we could never reclaim. One evening, as the office was starting to empty out, Amelia stayed behind. We were sitting in the dimly lit conference room, papers scattered around us, but neither of us was paying attention to the contracts in front of us. There was a tension in the air, one that had been growing between us with every meeting, every lingering glance. "I've missed this," she said suddenly, her voice soft and almost shy. "I've missed talking to you, laughing with you." I looked up, my breath catching in my throat at the vulnerability in her eyes. "I've missed it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. There was so much more I wanted to say, but I was afraid that if I opened that door, I'd never be able to close it again. She reached across the table, her fingers lightly brushing mine. It was such a simple touch, yet it sent a jolt through me. I could see the way her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected to feel it too. Her hand lingered on mine for a moment longer, and then, as if realizing what she was doing, she pulled back. "Sorry," she murmured, her cheeks flushing a soft pink. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was racing. I liked it." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like we were back in high school, standing in the corridor after classes, too shy to admit what we both wanted. But now we were no longer kids. Life was so much more complicated, tangled up in choices and responsibilities. I tried to focus on the papers in front of me, but all I could think about was how close she was, how the scent of her perfume filled the room, stirring up memories of days long gone. I didn't even realize that I had been staring until she looked up, catching my gaze. "Max," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She was so close now that I could see every fleck of gold in her brown eyes, the way her breath hitched slightly as she looked at me. I knew I should step back, keep my distance, but I couldn't. I was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Without thinking, I leaned in, my fingers brushing her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes fluttered shut, her lips parting slightly. And then, before I could stop myself, I kissed her. The moment our lips met, it was like time stopped. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, filled with years of unspoken longing, the ghosts of memories we had both tried so hard to bury. Her lips were warm and tasted faintly of the coffee we'd shared earlier, and I couldn't help but lose myself in that brief, stolen moment. But then she pulled back, her eyes wide with shock. "Max, we shouldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling.
"I'm engaged."
"I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I know, and I'm sorry." I pulled away, stepping back as if burned, the reality of what I'd just done crashing down on me. I shouldn't have. But before I could finish, she reached out, her fingers lightly grazing mine again. "Don't apologize," she said, her voice almost a whisper. I wanted it too." We stood there, caught in that fragile moment, not knowing what to do next. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the way her emotions warred with the logical part of her mind that told her this was wrong. but her fingers tightened around mine, and for a second, it felt like nothing else mattered. No fiancés, no commitments, just the two of us, standing on the edge of something we couldn't name. "Amelia?" I said softly, stepping closer, my hands trembling as I reached for her. I wanted to hold her, to feel her warmth against me, to somehow freeze this moment and live in it forever. I can't stop thinking about you. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But every time I close my eyes, all I see is you. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, biting her lip. "Max, what are we doing?" she whispered. "This is madness. I'm getting married. But do you love him?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. I saw her flinch, and for a moment, I regretted asking. But I needed to know. I needed to hear her say it so that I could finally let her go. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked up at me with those same eyes that had once made me believe in forever. And I saw the answer there, hidden beneath layers of guilt and uncertainty. I reached out and pulled her into a hug, wrapping my arms around her as if I could shield her from the world, from the choices that were tearing her apart. She melted into my embrace, her hands clutching at my shirt, and for a few precious seconds, it felt like everything was right again. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart against my chest, her warmth seeping into me, and all I wanted was to hold her forever. But then she pulled away, her eyes filled with a mix of longing and despair. "I have to go," she said, her voice shaky. "I can't do this, Max. I can't betray him like this." I nodded, trying to hide the pain that was clawing at my chest. "I understand," I whispered, even though it was a lie. "I won't stop you." She turned to leave, but just as she reached the door, she paused. For a moment it looked like she might turn back, that she might take one last step toward me. But then, with a deep breath, she pushed the door open and disappeared into the hallway. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The office felt colder without her, emptier. I knew I should have let her go, let her live the life she had chosen. But all I could think about was the way she had looked at me, the way her lips had felt against mine. This was more than just old feelings coming back to haunt us. It was something deeper, something neither of us could deny. And I knew, even as I tried to convince myself that this had to end, that it was far from over. This was only the beginning. Days turned into a blur after that last evening together. I hadn't heard from Amelia, and with each day that passed, I tried to convince myself that this was for the best. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I buried myself in work, taking on every case that came my way, hoping that if I filled my days with enough distractions, I might forget the way her eyes had looked into mine, filled with a yearning that mirrored my own. But no amount of work could erase her from my thoughts. Every quiet moment was filled with memories, of her laughter, the warmth of her touch, the way she looked at me with a softness that seemed to reach into the deepest parts of my heart. I kept telling myself to let go, to move on. But the truth was, she had come back into my life like a fire, reigniting feelings I thought I had long buried. And then, just as I was starting to convince myself that I would never see her again, she appeared. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the sky seemed to cry endlessly. I was the last one in the office, finishing up some late paperwork, when there was a soft knock on my door. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw her standing there. She was drenched from the rain, her hair damp and clinging to her cheeks, her eyes wide and searching. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, neither of us saying a word. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of us standing there, caught in a moment that felt both fragile and inevitable. "Amelia," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I didn't know where else to go," she said softly, stepping into the room. "I've been thinking about you, about everything, and I just couldn't stay away any longer." I rose from my chair, my heart pounding as I walked toward her. "You shouldn't be here," I said, even though I wanted nothing more than for her to stay. "You're engaged." "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I've tried to forget you." I've tried to focus on my future with him, but every time I close my eyes, it's you I see." The honesty in her words shattered whatever resolve I had left. I took a hesitant step closer, reaching out to brush a strand of wet hair from her face. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into my touch as if she had been waiting for it for years. "Amelia, we can't keep doing this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It's not fair to him or to you." She opened her eyes, and I could see tears brimming there. "I know," she said quietly, "but I can't stop thinking about us, Max. I can't stop wondering what we could have had, what we still could have." I couldn't resist her any longer. I pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if I was afraid she might disappear again. She wrapped her arms around me, her face pressed against my shoulder, and for a moment, we simply stood there, holding on to each other as if the rest of the world didn't exist. "I've missed you so much," she whispered, her breath warm against my neck. "I've tried to pretend that I moved on, that I'm happy, but I'm not. Not really." I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "I've missed you too," I confessed, my voice cracking. "Every day, I've thought about you. I tried to forget, but you're always there, Amelia. You never really left." We pulled back slightly, just enough to look into each other's eyes. I could see the conflict in her gaze, the silent war she was fighting between her heart and her mind. Without thinking, I reached up and gently cupped her face, my thumb brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "What are we going to do?" I asked softly. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All I know is that I'm afraid of losing you again." I couldn't help myself. I leaned in and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to her forehead, lingering there for a moment as if I could somehow protect her from all the decisions that were tearing her apart. She sighed softly, her hands resting on my chest, and I could feel her heart beating wildly beneath her touch. "Max, I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I have a life with him, I have plans. But being with you here, right now, it feels like I found a part of myself that I lost." I held her close, letting the silence speak for us. The rain continued to pour outside, a soft background to the turmoil in both our hearts. "You don't have to decide right now," I said gently. "Just stay a little longer. Let's pretend, just for tonight, that there's no one else, that it's just us." She looked up at me, her eyes full of confusion and longing. And then, slowly, she nodded. I led her to the small sofa in the corner of my office, where we sat side by side, our hands intertwined. For a while, we simply talked, reminiscing about the old days, about the dreams we once had, letting the weight of the present slip away. At some point, she leaned her head on my shoulder, and I rested my cheek against her hair, breathing in her familiar scent. It was comforting, like coming home after being lost for so long. I didn't want the moment to end. I wanted to freeze time and stay like this forever, in a world where the only thing that mattered was the way her hand felt in mine. Eventually, though, reality began to creep back in. The sky outside had grown darker, the rain turning into a soft drizzle. Amelia pulled away slightly, her eyes red from crying, but there was a softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "I should go," she said quietly, though her hands were still clutching mine. "I need to figure things out, Max. I need to decide what I really want." I nodded, even though my heart was screaming for her to stay. "I understand," I said, my voice barely steady. "But no matter what you choose, just know that I'll always care about you." She leaned in and kissed me softly on the cheek, a gentle, lingering touch that spoke of everything we couldn't say. "Goodbye, Max," she whispered, her voice full of unshed tears. I hope we find our way." And with that, she slipped out of the door, leaving me standing alone in the darkened office. I watched the rain as it fell against the windows, each drop a reminder of the tears we had both shed. I wanted to chase after her, to beg her to stay, but I knew that whatever happened next had to be her choice. As I sank back into my chair, I realized that the ache in my chest wasn't just sadness. It was also hope. Because for the first time in years, I felt like we had a chance, however small, however fragile. And whatever came next, I knew I would hold onto that hope with everything I had. The next day arrived with a heavy sky, thick with the promise of rain. I spent the morning pacing around my apartment, replaying our conversation in my mind. Amelia had asked me to meet her at the park near the old fountain, the place where we used to steal moments of peace all those years ago. My heart was torn between hope and dread. This meeting would be the moment of truth, where we would decide if we had a future together, or if it was time to let go once and for all. I arrived early, the chill of the late autumn air biting through my coat. The park was nearly empty, the branches of the trees bare, their fallen leaves scattered across the ground like fragments of forgotten memories. I stood by the fountain, waiting, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Finally, I saw her approaching. Amelia looked as beautiful as ever, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. She was wrapped in a thick scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and for a moment, I was overwhelmed with the urge to take her into my arms and never let her go. "Hi, Max," she said softly, stopping a few steps away from me. "Hi," I replied, trying to read her expression, searching for any hint of what she had come here to say. "I'm glad you came." She gave me a small, sad smile. "I wasn't sure if I should," she confessed. "But I couldn't go through with everything without talking to you one last time." Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. "So, you've made your decision?" I asked, my voice barely steady. I could feel my heart pounding, my hands trembling slightly. She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, I have," she whispered. "Moksh, I'm going to marry him." The words hung between us, heavy and final. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. "I see," I said quietly, turning away for a moment to collect myself. "And that's really what you want?" She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against mine, so light it was almost like a ghost of a touch. "No," she admitted, her voice breaking. "No, it's not what I want, but it's what I have to do." I turned back to her, my eyes searching hers, desperate to understand. "Why, Amelia? Why are you choosing him if your heart is telling you something else?" Her eyes were filled with tears now, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Because I made a promise. I made a commitment to him, and he's a good man. He doesn't deserve to be hurt because of my confusion. He's built his future around me, and I can't just shatter that because of what I feel for you." I reached for her hand, holding it tightly, as if that could somehow change everything. "But what about us? What about everything we could have? Are you really willing to give that up?" She looked down at our joined hands, her tears falling silently. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't destroy him. I can't be the person who ruins his life for the sake of my own happiness." A deep, aching silence fell between us, broken only by the sound of the fountain's gentle trickle. I wanted to fight, to convince her that love, real, deep love, was worth the risk, worth the pain. But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that she had already made up her mind. She was torn between duty and desire, and in the end, duty had won. "Then, this is it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "This is really goodbye?" Amelia's eyes met mine, filled with a pain that mirrored my own. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wish it could have been different," she said softly. "But I have to let you go, Max. We both need to let each other go." I pulled her into my arms one last time, holding her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body pressed against mine. She buried her face in my shoulder, her tears soaking through my coat. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared, and there was only us, wrapped in a desperate embrace that we both knew had to end. "I love you," I whispered into her hair, my voice breaking. "I always will." "I love you too," she replied, her voice muffled against my chest. "But sometimes, love isn't enough. We stood there for what felt like hours, neither of us wanting to let go. But eventually, she pulled away, her eyes red and swollen, her hands lingering on mine for just a moment longer. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she stepped back. "I need to go," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to move forward with the life I chose." I watched as she turned away, her figure slowly fading into the distance, leaving me standing alone by the fountain. The cold air seemed to seep into my bones, and I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest, an emptiness that I knew would take a long time to heal. The wedding was that weekend. I spent those days in a daze, the world passing by in a blur. I kept telling myself that I should be happy for her, that she had made her choice, but the pain was relentless. I couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop replaying our last moments together. On the day of her wedding, I found myself walking through the park, back to the fountain where we had said our final goodbye. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the promise of rain. I stood there for a long time, watching as the leaves swirled around me, trying to find a way to let her go. But as the first drops of rain began to fall, I realized something. I would never truly let her go. She would always be a part of me, a ghost that would linger in the quiet corners of my mind, a love that would remain unfulfilled. Sometimes, love isn't about happy endings. Sometimes, it's about learning to live with the echoes of what could have been, the memories of a love that was too fragile to last. And so, with one last look at the place where we had shared our final embrace, I turned and walked away, letting the rain wash over me, knowing that, somehow, I had to find a way to move on. But in my heart, I knew I would always carry her with me, a bittersweet reminder that sometimes, even the deepest love cannot overcome the choices we make.